Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Here we are from IVCC Lab again. What we're going to start right now, we're going to begin the skeletal unit. And yes, I am aware that we have not had our first lab test or first lecture test, but don't worry. We're trying to get the lab information up to you relatively quickly and on a consistent basis. So what we're starting on page 17 of the checklist today. And what we're going to do is we are going to go over the axial skeleton. And yes, there will be, you will need to know the skeleton, what it looks like as a whole, but you will also have to know what the bones look like disarticulated. And when we mean disarticulated, we mean the bones sitting by themselves. So yes, you will have to know that. But again, after these videos, hopefully we will be able to clear that up for you. Also, too, in your checklist at the very top, you'll see there's a little asterisk that indicates right or left. You will not need to know right or left because that's going to be way too difficult for this course. If you can't actually pick the bones up and see them, it becomes a little bit more difficult. So we are going to eliminate right and left questions from the test altogether. So without any further ado, here we go. We are going to look at the skull today for right now. And so here it is right here, and the first bone that we're going to look at is the frontal bone. And yes, that is going to be the bone that is found right in the forehead region, right here. So here's frontal bone right here. Now, some of the structures that we're going to go down, the first structure is the supraorbital foramen. Very big key for bones. When you see the term foramen, just automatically know that it's a hole. So in this case, the supraorbital foramen, folks, is going to be this hole right above the eye socket. Okay? Then in parentheses, you'll see the term supraorbital notch. Sometimes what happens is the foramen don't develop fully, and what ends up happening is a small section of the top of the eye socket, it looks like it's missing bone, and that would be the supraorbital notch. So on this skull, we have a supraorbital notch here, and then the supraorbital foramen right there. Again, the location, again, supraorbital, just remember that it is above the eye socket. The next term then is the coronal suture. The coronal suture is one of the joints that holds the skull bones together. And where we find the coronal suture is what separates the frontal bone from the two parietal bones. So if we come right here on the top of the skull right here, here is my frontal bone right here. And then here are my two parietal bones. So if we look at this jagged line running right across here, this right here would be the frontal, or the coronal suture, coronal suture. And then last but not least, the frontal sinus. A sinus is an empty cavity within the bone. What the sinuses do is the sinuses definitely reduce the weight of their skull, and they're filled with mucus, and obviously anybody who has a sinus cold knows where the pressure is. And if you stop and think about it, you tell me if I'm wrong, do we feel pressure in the forehead and along the side of our nose and at the top of our nose? That's where all the sinuses are located, and we're going to show those to you. Now, where you would find the frontal sinus, if we had it dug out on here, again, here is the frontal bone right here. The frontal sinus would be here, but the only bad thing about this bone, folks, is that the bone has not been chipped away. So, but what we can do is we can also show this to you on a model right here on the sagittal section of the head right here. So right here, here's frontal bone. Here is the frontal sinus right here. Now, on the frontal bone disarticulated, here's a disarticulated frontal bone, folks. Again, one of the big keys, what you want to look for is you're looking for the top half of the eye sockets on here. So that should be a dead giveaway that this is the frontal bone. And again, if we look really close, well, we could see a supraorbital notch right here, but there is no supraorbital foramen present. Okay, so frontal bone. Again, just take a look at that again. Not a big thing. And then here is another frontal bone with some of the more of the bone removed. But again, what do we see? We can see the top half of the eye sockets right here. But what I love about this bone is this bone shows a great frontal sinus and its location right here. So again, frontal bone, and what my probe is in is the frontal sinus. So again, folks, where that's going to be sitting at, that's going to be sitting approximately right here. Think about it when you get a really bad head cold, the amount of pressure that builds up right there. The next two bones are the parietal bones, and the parietal bones are going to be the bones at the top of the skull. So again, here we go, 1 and 2. And what we need to know, the structure to know, is a sagittal suture. That is the joint line. That's the joint that separates the right and left parietal bones from one another. And again, do not worry about right or left. But the sagittal suture, folks, it runs right down the middle of the skull and it separates the two parietal bones from one another. And then again, a disarticulated parietal bone right here. And again, there's nothing really distinguishing about it. There are no eye sockets, we don't, like where the frontal bone is, we see the frontal bone with the eye sockets. On the parietal bone, it doesn't look anything more than a big eggshell. Okay, the next bone then is the temporal bone. The temporal bone is going to be found on the lateral side of the skull. And this is all frontal bone right here. Or temporal bone, I'm sorry, temporal bone, folks. So here's the temporal bone all right through there. Okay. The first structure is the squamosal suture. The squamosal suture is what separates the temporal bone from the parietal bone. So if we look real quick, we can see this real faint joint line running right around the temporal bone right there. And that right there, ladies and gentlemen, that is the squamous suture. The next structure is the zygomatic process. Don't worry about the part, we're not going to be that specific. And it does make up the zygomatic arch. This is this structure right here that's found more like right off on the lateral side of our face. But this bony projection coming off of the temporal bone right there, that is the zygomatic process. And that's really all we need you to know for that, zygomatic process. Okay, we will come back to the mandibular fossa, but on the lateral side of the skull right here, this is number 4 in your checklist, folks. This hole on the lateral side of the skull, of the temporal bone right here, that opening right there, that is the external auditory meatus. What you are looking at right there, that is the ear canal. That is where the Q-tips go, okay? So if we come back, we're gonna skip over styloid process and come back to that shortly, but the next one is the mastoid process. And the mastoid process is this large rounded mass of bone that is just posterior to the external auditory meatus. So right here, here is the mastoid process. And again, if you want to feel that on yourself, what you want to do is just come right in behind your ear, and then you can feel that rounded portion of bone behind your ear. That right there is the mastoid process. And what's that used for is we can use that structure to test for if someone is having a hearing difficulty. But that's just an aside right there. So again, but you can see the mastoid process very well right here from the lateral view. If we come to the inferior view, we can still see the mastoid processes right here. Now the next, the third structure that we told you to forget was the mandibular fossa. Here's another big note, folks. A fossa is a depression. Where a foramen is a hole, a fossa is a depression. And so if we come up here and we look, here is there are the mastoid processes. If you just move anterior to that, your finger will fall into two large depressions right here and here. That is the mandibular fossa. Now, the importance of that structure, what those structures are, is this is where the mandible is going to fit in. So again, from the lateral view, there is the mandibular fossa. If we come right in here and we put the mandible in there, we can see that is the joint surface that the mandible moves on for us to open and close our mouth. The styloid process, which is not on this, so we're going to grab another skull to show you the styloid process, which is part of the temporal bone. The styloid process will be these small bony projections right here. Okay, styloid process right here. Again, they are very thin bony structures, and so if we want to look at it from this side, we can say there's the external auditory meatus. We move posterior, there is the mastoid process. If we move anterior to the external auditory meatus, there is the styloid process. Okay, so again, what does that little structure serve us in our body? That little structure right there serves as a site of muscle attachment for muscles that are involved in hearing and also some of the swallowing. Okay, now the next structure then going right down your checklist is the carotid canal. So if we come back here, folks, the styloid process would be approximately right here, but again, we won't use anything that's broken on the test, so trust me, we won't. But if we move medial to that, we fall into this large hole right here. That right there is the carotid canal. Okay, so again, we go mastoid process right here. We just move anterior and medial, and we would run into where the styloid process is. And then we move straight medial from here, from the styloid process, right to the carotid canal. Then the next structure that we need you to know would be the jugular foramen and jugular fossa. Those structures are going to be posterior to the carotid canal. So when we move our probe back, the first structure that we'd fall into is this depression right here, and that is the jugular fossa. And then if we just move the probe slightly, and you can see that the probe falls in to the skull, that right there is jugular foramen. So if we come here, we go carotid canal, jugular fossa, jugular foramen. They're all right in the same area, folks. Okay, what is the last structure? Oh, and then the last structure, folks, would be the internal auditory meatus. So where we need to go, this is the inferior surface of the skull. So for the internal auditory meatus, we have to go into the cranial cavity itself. And what we're going to do is we come here and we can see these two ridges of bones right here. Those two ridges of bones are part of the temporal bone. And then what we're going to do is we're going to find this hole right here, right on the medial side of this ridge of bone. That right there, that is the internal auditory meatus. Okay, so let's show you the temporal bone disarticulated right here. Here is what the temporal bone looks like disarticulated. Now, we're not going to see every structure on here, folks. But here, what do we have here? We have the zygomatic process, or part of it. We have a great mastoid process. We have a wonderful external auditory meatus. We can't really see, and then we have the mandibular fossa right there that my finger falls into. We won't be able to tell the foramen and the canals because the bone's separated. But what we can also see on the inside portion of the bone, we can see the internal auditory meatus. So there's the external auditory meatus. Here comes the internal auditory meatus. Okay? And then the last bone for this portion of the video is going to be the occipital bone. And the occipital bone right here, the occipital bone is going to be the bone at the back of the skull. And you can see that the occipital bone also wraps to the inferior surface of the skull. So occipital bone, all right in through here. Now the first structure that the occipital bone contains is the lambdoidal suture. And here's the lambdoidal suture right here, folks. This jagged line right here, it almost looks like a V, an inverted V. You can see that coming out right there. What that does is that separates the occipital bone from the two parietal bones right above it. So that is the lambdoidal suture. Okay, then the next structure is the foramen magnum. Again, foramen is a hole. Foramen means big. So if we come right here to the inferior surface of the skull again, can everybody see the foramen magnum? If you cannot see this large hole, I recommend that you go to the optometrist sometime within the next week. Okay, and then the next structures are the occipital condyles. The occipital condyles are these two rounded masses of bone right here. And what that does is that's the surface that is going to rest on our first vertebra, the first cervical vertebra. That is where our head movement, nodding and shaking our head, or definitely nodding our head, occurs. Okay, so there are the occipital condyles right there. And then, as we come down to finish up with the occipital bone, the hypoglossal canals are these tiny little openings right here, just superior to the occipital condyles. Yes, it looks like the probe is in the foramen magnum, but if we look as the probe is running through here, that little opening right there is the hypoglossal canal. Okay, so let's just show you what the occipital bone looks like disarticulated. The occipital bone disarticulated might be helpful if we had one. Here is the occipital bone disarticulated. And again, folks, what is the big telltale sign? Again, our foramen magnum. But then again, we move to the lateral sides. We can see the rounded occipital condyles. And then again, if we come right in through here, we can stick the probe in right through there. We can see that little opening right there, that little hole, and that is the hypoglossal canal. Okay, welcome back. What we're going to do now is we're going to go through the sphenoid bone and ethmoid bone and some other associated bones within the nasal cavity because it kind of just blends more nicely this way. So, and usually when we're live in the lab and we're going through this, these bones usually take us about an hour to get through because there's some smaller structures obviously, and it's a little bit more difficult to see. Obviously, we're going to cut this down a little bit since we're just here ourselves and we don't have questions. But we still want you guys asking questions. Feel free to get a hold of Mr. Fogel and myself, and we're going to try to answer it. Again, my best way to get a hold of me, folks, is really through text message. When I'm at work, I don't always have availability to a computer right then and there. So if you need something answered relatively quickly, get a hold of me via text. Mr. Fogel might be the same way, and we'll put Mr. Fogel's phone number, if that's all right with him, into the syllabus so you guys will have access to that. So here we go, folks. So the sphenoid and ethmoid bone. These are going to be bones inside our cranial cavity. They're a little bit deeper in our skull, so we don't see them. So we have to go inside the cranial cavity right here. So the first bone is the sphenoid bone. And the sphenoid bone, folks, is from here all the way out to here, and then up to here, and then back down in through here. So we can see that a little bit, and then the ethmoid bone is sitting approximately right in through here. So if we wanted to show you the sphenoid bone, and the sphenoid bone looks a little bit different than any of the other bones we have showed you so far, and here is the sphenoid bone right here. So again, it has a pretty unique shape to it. Almost sometimes people say it looks like a bat, butterfly. Hey, whatever works for you, you can call it whatever you want, but just make sure you put sphenoid bone on the test. So that is the sphenoid bone. So if we start going down the structures, the greater wing, there are two greater wings, and those are going to be out here on the lateral sides of the bone. So that is going to be your greater wings. So if we come back into here and we put that in there, if you can see this one here, how it extends down here as we put the bone in, you can see that this would be the greater wing running right out here on the sphenoid bone. If we also come up here, here is the greater wing just anterior to the temporal bone on the lateral side of the skull. But again, that is the greater wings. Now sitting right in between that, right here, the greater wings, we have this structure right here, and that is the lesser wing. Now again, when we're looking at a real skull, sometimes it's a little hard because they're not as good as the models because the bones have been beat up over the years. But I want you to visualize that. So again, keep your eyes on this. This is the lesser wing right here. We put that in there, and that's how the bone would be sitting. And now we remove it, and then can you see the lesser wing sitting right in through here? Now again, it may not be as sharp and as pointed as the model right here, but here is the lesser wing right there, folks, sitting right between the two greater wings. Okay, and then the orbital surface of the sphenoid bone. This is the posterior surface, and you can tell the posterior region, you got this large depression, which we will come back and we will talk about in a little while. But we come right here on the anterior surface of the bone. You have these flat, smooth surfaces right here. These right there are the orbital surfaces of the sphenoid bone. So if we come right here and we drop that into the skull, you can see right back here, if I can hold that there without dropping everything, if you can imagine that getting pushed all the way down, this surface right here that makes up the lateral posterior wall of the eye socket, that is the orbital surface of our sphenoid bone. Okay, and now we have a list of foramen. So get ready to see a bunch of holes here, folks. We're going to show those to you on the skull first, on the intact skull, and then we will come and show you them on the disarticulated sphenoid bone. So foramen rotundum, first one, to see it when the skull's fully intact, connected and put together, not disarticulated, foramen rotundum is inside the cranial cavity. So if we come right here, if we drop right down below the lesser wing, and we come to this hole right here, right inside the cranial cavity, that is the foramen rotundum. Okay, if we come down here, here's the lesser wing right here. We drop straight down. There is foramen rotundum on that side. Now, before we get to the other three foramen, I want to go down to number 11 in your checklist, and that's the pterygoid processes or pterygoid plates. So if we flip it over to the inferior surface of the skull, if we look for our last molar right here, if we just keep moving posterior, what we run into are these two thin bony plates right here, and then also right here and here. Those are the pterygoid plates or processes. Now what we can do is now we can start finding the other foramen based off of that if we just move lateral. So these are smaller foramen, folks. So the first one is foramen ovale, and if you can come up in and you can see that there's a nice oval shaped structure right there, opening. That is the foramen ovale. We move a little bit more laterally. We have this very small hole right here. That's foramen spinosum. Now, if we also, too, if we go back to foramen ovale and move medially, we fall into this large hole right there, and that large hole is foramen lacerum. The key is, folks, foramen lacerum is only seen on a fully articulated skull. Foramen lacerum is only found on a fully articulated skull. We will not see it on a disarticulated sphenoid bone. So one more time, folks, you find the pterygoid plates or processes, which are just posterior to the last molar. Then you move lateral from those, and then you fall into foramen ovale. You move lateral, fall into foramen spinosum. you go back to foramen ovale and move medial, and you fall right into foramen lacerum right here. A couple more structures. We will come back to sphenoids. Optic foramen we are going to take off. It's very difficult to show you if you're not here and not actually holding the skull. So optic foramen, cancel it out. You're welcome. The sphenoid sinus we're going to come back to, but the sella turcica. The sella turcica, folks, is an important structure. And where do you find it at? Inside the cranial cavity. And what it is, it's this depression right here. And how do you find that is you start right on the midline of the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone, and you move posterior until your probe falls into a large depression. Now, there's an important structure that the sella turcica holds, and that is the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is found attached to the inferior surface of the skull, and what ends up happening is the pituitary gland sits right inside the sella turcica. Now, with the bone intact, that leaves us the sphenoid sinus. Again, you will only see a sphenoid sinus on a disarticulated sphenoid bone. But where the sphenoid sinus sits is it sits right below the sella turcica. So if we pull this model up over here, we come to this mid-sagittal section right here, we can see our pituitary gland sitting right here. Okay, there's the pituitary gland. There is the sella turcica that the pituitary gland is sitting within. And then finally, this opening right here, or this large space right here, right below sella turcica, that is the sphenoid sinus. Okay? So now, when we look at this right here, here is the plastic model. Again, how do we find that? How do we find the sella turcica? Start on the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone and move posterior into that large depression, and that is the sella turcica. So now if we come back, this is again the posterior surface of the bone. We come around to the anterior surface, and then we can see these openings right here and right here. And those are there's the openings to the sphenoid sinus. Now, if I come right here, you can see which direction the probe is heading. It's heading right towards the sella turcica, folks. So that is the sphenoid bone. Now, real quick, if we look, we have our pterygoid plates and processes. We come lateral to them. We can see a nice foramen ovale right there. We can see the foramen spinosum right there. Again, since this is disarticulated, we will not see the foramen lacerum. But now if we come back in here, we also now can see our foramen rotundum right here, just as we move off of the lesser wing. Here is foramen rotundum. I'm ready. So here we go. Here's the ethmoid bone now, folks. So again, right here in the cranial cavity, there's our sphenoid bone. We move up, and here's a portion of our ethmoid bone. So here is what the ethmoid bone looks like right here. Again, and I would hope that it would look different than what everything else has looked like so far. And so where does the ethmoid bone sit? The ethmoid bone sits pretty much smack dab right about here in relationship. All right, so as we start going down the list, perpendicular plate we are going to come back to. Just make the note though, the perpendicular plate is found on the inferior surface of the bone. We will come back to that momentarily, but I do want to go to the crista galli. Now, if we look inside the cranial cavity, the nice thing about this right here, we have this little structure that looks like a little shark fin that is jetting out of the bone right there. That is the crista galli, and what I want you to make the note is the crista galli is found superior on the ethmoid bone. Okay, so there's crista galli. Now the next structure is the cribriform plate. The cribriform plate is a bony structure that surrounds the crista galli, and in this one we can see a little bit of it remaining right here. So we got this structure right here. We got this structure right there. That is what the cribriform plate looks like. Now you can also see that they got tiny little holes running through the bone, you know, the bony plate right there. The importance of those holes are, folks, is that is where cavity and travel up into the cranial cavity. We'll talk more about that during the census chapter. Okay, so now on the disarticulated bone. So what we're looking for here, again, there's our little shark's fin right there. That is the crista galli right there. And again, this is the superior portion of the bone. Now this one is not the best, but the surface around that right there, that structure that surrounds crista galli, that is your cribriform plate. The ethmoid air cells. The ethmoid bone as a whole has nothing but sinuses. So again, think about it. It's sitting pretty much right on top of our nose, folks. So again, think about when you get that sinus pressure. Do you get a lot of pressure built up on the bridge of your nose? And that is due to the ethmoid sinuses or the ethmoid air cells. And here are two large ones right here that are visible for us to see. Okay. Now the next two structures, you got the superior nasal concha and middle nasal concha. And for the most, we're gonna add inferior nasal concha too. That is letter M in your checklist. Where we can find them to show you to start with, they are structures found in our nasal cavity. The purpose of these there's three ridges. Here is the superior nasal concha. Here is the middle nasal concha. Here is the inferior nasal concha. Superior nasal concha, middle nasal concha, inferior nasal concha. Those are ridges found in our nasal cavity which increase the surface area of our nasal cavity. We can show you these on the skull, everything except, and the bone, except for the superior nasal concha. Okay? So we will be able to show you on the bone, at least on the ethmoid bone, we will show you the middle nasal concha. Inside the nasal cavity, we'll be able to show you the middle nasal concha and the inferior nasal concha. So without further ado, let's come right back to the ethmoid bone. So again, here's the crista galli, which is the superior portion of the bone. Now remember, I said the perpendicular plate is found on the inferior surface of the bone. And so this very thin, tiny plate right here that's running right on the midline, that is the perpendicular plate right here. But now when we're on the complete inferior surface, we can see the perpendicular plate right there at the probe. And then we have these bony ridges here and here on either side of it. Those are the middle nasal concha, folks. Okay? Now, getting back to the perpendicular plate is one of the bones that help make up our nasal septum. The nasal septum is the structure that divides the right and left nasal cavity from one another. Okay, so and there's another bone that helps that makes up the part of the nasal septum, and that is the vomer. The vomer is letter L in your checklist. So what Mr. Fogel and I are going to do is we're going to take a walk down to this model down here, and we're going to explain this all to you. So this model right here has a very good job of illustrating the nasal septum. So what we can see is we can see a bone here, and the blue is representing cartilage. So if you grab the tip of your nose and you move it back and forth, you will feel that cartilage move. But as we move posteriorly, the septum turns into cartilage, or into bone, I'm sorry. So the superior portion of the nasal septum right here, this bone right here, this is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. As we move inferiorly, right here, this inferior bone right here, this is the vomer. Okay, so perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, vomer. Okay, so go ahead and take a look at that. Now, when we look here inside the nasal cavity, we can see the septum right here. So when we look right here,
we got that bone right there on top running right down the midline. That is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Then you can see these two ridges on the lateral sides of the perpendicular plate. Those are the middle nasal concha. And then we come down to this bone right here. That is the vomer. Now also too, what we can see, if you look, there are two bony ridges on either side of the vomer. Those are the inferior nasal concha. So again, we can show you middle and inferior nasal concha right here, along with the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone in the vomer. We can show you perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone and the vomer on this orange torso model. We can show you perpendicular plate and the middle nasal concha on the disarticulated ethmoid bone, or we can show you the superior, middle, inferior nasal concha right here on this torso model. On our ethmoid bone, if we go out to the lateral surfaces here on the outside, lateral surfaces, these nice, smooth, flat surfaces right here, folks. This right here is the orbital surface of the ethmoid bone. Orbital surface of the ethmoid bone. Okay. Next bone we're going to talk about is the maxillary bone. And there are two maxillary bones, one on the right, one on the left. Now the big giveaway, one of the big giveaways for this bone is these two bones contain the upper row of teeth, folks. So the right and left maxillary bones contain the upper row of teeth. That's a very big important thing to note. The structures, the palatine process of the maxillary bone is going to make up the anterior portion of the roof of the mouth. So we can see it right here. Here is the palatine process of the bone on the right. Here's the palatine process on the bone on the left. Palatine process of the maxillary bone. The next structure would be the maxillary sinus. Again, you will only see the maxillary sinus on a disarticulated maxillary bone. So here we go right here. Here's the maxillary bone right here. Again, one of the big keys, look for the teeth. And then right here, what are we pointing to right here? That is the palatine process of the maxillary bone. But then when we come in and we move this over to the medial side of the maxillary bone, I'm going to stick my finger right into that large sinus right there. So again, just think about it when you have a cold or sinus pressure. Here's how the maxillary bone would be sitting. Do you develop a lot of discomfort right out here in your cheek region? The reason being that you most likely will is because that is where the maxillary sinuses are sitting right there. And if you've never experienced it, stay healthy. We like that, so stay healthy. So that is your maxillary sinus. The alveolar processes, quite simply, are the sockets in which the teeth fit within. So right here, we had somebody gracious enough from Alabama to donate one of their skulls. Oh, no, sorry, that was a bad joke. We don't want to make fun of people. But as we come in through here, when we look at where the sockets are, where those openings are, those are the alveolar processes, and that is where the teeth will fit into. So alveolar processes. Infraorbital foramen. We already showed you the supraorbital foramen, which was above the eye socket. Infraorbital foramen is going to be a hole below the eye socket or inferior to the eye socket. And here it is right here, folks. That is the infraorbital foramen right here. Okay, infraorbital foramen. And then the last structure is the anterior palatine foramen. And the anterior palatine foramen, folks, is this hole right here behind the two front teeth. Okay, That is the anterior palatine foramen. And then again, one more time, here is what the maxillary bone looks like disarticulated. But again, the big key right here, folks, teeth. That should be one of the big giveaways. Okay. The next bone, the palatine bone. The palatine bone makes up the posterior portion of the roof of the mouth. So if we come right here, here is the palatine bone here, and here is the palatine bone here. Now, you got to be careful, because what is this structure? This structure is the palatine process of the maxillary bone. Just alone right here, this is the palatine bone. What you'll see a little suture line right here that separates those. And then the structure that you need to know for it is the greater palatine foramen. The greater palatine foramen is that hole right there, medial to the last molar. Okay, so there is your greater palatine foramen. The next bone then is the lacrimal bone. That's the bone right here in our cheek. Ladies, when you put your blush on in the morning, or wherever you put your blush on, ladies, that's where you're going over the zygomatic bone. So right here is the zygomatic bone right here. Okay? And then if we did this right here, here is the zygomatic bone disarticulated. But what you will notice in here, there's this slight little curvature of it that helps form like an inferior portion of the eye socket wall. So again, there's the lacrimal bone disarticulating. Zygomatic bone. Sorry, I jumped ahead. Zygomatic bone, folks. Zygomatic bone. Zygomatic bone right here. And again, what you're looking, you just match that up right there. And you got that little curvature of the eye socket right there. So the zygomatic bone, once again. Zygomatic bone. Lacrimal bone. I knew I was going somewhere with that. Lacrimal bone is going to be the first bone in the medial side of the eye wall. So now if we come in onto the real skull here, we can see that is a perfect example of a lacrimal bone that is completely missing, but that is the perfect outline of it. And that's where it's going to sit. But in real life and in lab tests, we do not use pictures of bones that are broken and say what would be here. So what we're going to do is we're going to come to the plastic skull model, and then we can come right on in through here, and then we can see there's the lacrimal bone sitting right there. Okay, so it's the first bone in on the medial side of the eye wall. That's the lacrimal bone. The next bone is the nasal bone, and the nasal bone would be right here. And again, there are two nasal bones, 1, 2. So basically, it's the bone right at the bridge of our nose. Nasal bone, sorry. Nasal bone, right there, folks. The next bone is the mandible. Here's the mandible right here, folks. And yes, it's what we consider to be our jaw. But again, jaw doesn't get it done on the test. Mandible gets it done on the test. So as we start looking at the structures, the body runs from here all the way back to here. So this is all body right here. Now, what I always say is if you see teeth in the alveolar processes, everything below that would be the body. And that's one way to determine that. The next structure is the angle. So if we come right here, this posterior curved portion right here, that is the angle of the mandible. And then this superior projection right here with these two projections that come off of it, this projection right here, this is the ramus. Okay, so one more time. Body, come around, come around, come around. We reach towards the posterior portion of the bone. We got that curved part right there. That is the angle of the mandible. This superior projection in coming up, that is the ramus. Okay, the next structure then, symphysis. Cross symphysis off your checklist. We're not going to ask that. So the symphysis is gone. Now the next two structures, folks, the mandibular condyle and the coronoid process. These are the two projections that come off of the ramus. The first one is the mandibular condyle, that is the posterior projection, and it is more rounded. Okay, so there you can see the roundness to it, and it's the posterior portion of the bone. Now also too, what does the mandibular condyle fit into? The mandibular condyle fits into the mandibular fossa and allows us to open and close our mouth. Okay? Then that kind of leaves the anterior, more pointed projection off the ramus. That is the coronoid process. Okay, so mandibular condyle, posterior, coronoid process, anterior. Alveolar processes, it's the same thing, folks, as it was on the maxillary bones. It's the socket for the teeth. So anywhere where the tooth can fit in, that opening, that is the alveolar process. And then we have two foramen, two holes that we're looking for. The first one is the mental foramen. The mental foramen is right here on the body. Right here. And then the mandibular foramen is going to be found on the medial side of the ramus. So if I come right here, we slide the probe in right through there. There is the mandibular foramen. Back with the hyoid bone. And here is the hyoid bone right here, folks. It's this U-shaped bone. This is bone that's going to be found superior to our larynx. One thing about this bone, this is the only bone in the body that does not articulate with another bone. This is a free-floating bone. And so this is the hyoid bone. Again, there's not much to it. What this does is it serves as a site of muscle attachment for the muscles involved in swallowing and speech. So if I pull this model out right here, here is the larynx. And then if we move superior to it, we can see the hyoid bone right here. Here's the hyoid bone right here, folks. You can see that nice U-shaped bone. Next, a sutural or wormian bone. Sutural or wormian bones, folks, develop in our sutures on the skull, if at all. Not everybody has them. That's the main thing to remember. What ends up happening is sometimes there are a couple extra spots of calcification that occur and they ossify over time. If you have sutural bones, that just makes you unique at that point. If you don't, it doesn't make you any less. So again, sometimes they're considered to be extra bones in our body, but they develop within the sutures of the skull. And actually, we do happen to have one right here. So if we put our skull together right here, and we're going to look at the lambdoidal suture really closely, as we come up, you can see the suture coming here, here, and here, and then all of a sudden we'll see the suture at this point split up and split down, and then continue back on its way as one. But what's left in between those suture lines is that little bone right there. And that is what we call a sutural or wormian bone. See, so what we're looking for under normal circumstances is this line going here, the one line. But even right here, here is another little sutural bone. We can see how the suture line goes up and around it all the way and then continues on. So there is another little sutural bone. So again, on test, you just have to look really close at them. Okay, so again, sutural bones found developed within the sutures of our skull. Okay, and then last but not least, folks, we have the ossicles. These are the three bones that are found in the ear. Okay, so let's go ahead and we're going to hold that up. So do we got any glare now?
No, not too bad.
So what we can, these are actually bones from an adult, folks. So, I mean, I know it's kind of tough maybe to get a true appreciation looking at a video, but if you were up close in person, these bones are tiny. We have 3 in our right ear, 3 in our left ear, and these 3 bones are essential for us to be able to hear. So in order, they go the malleus is the first one, the incus, and the stapes. So again, I promise you they won't show up like this on the test though with the names underneath of them. Okay, so malleus, incus, and stapes. And so definitely know, just pay attention to those. How many minutes does that